Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land. In my case, it's the land of the Dharawal people, in whose footprints we inherit wisdom, culture, history, and respect for land and water. I would also like to pay my respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. Okay, now I've talking about the mystery of unconsciousness, and it really is a mystery because it has been an area that's been unexplored. And I think the reason we are now starting to look seriously at unconsciousness has arisen partly because of the observations made on people who are dying in palliative care circumstances. People have been dying for centuries, obviously, and medical services have been caring for people who have been unconscious. But it's only with palliative care has a lot of the mysteries surrounding death and dying become apparent or been spoken about. And it's that mystery which has led us to ask what is unconsciousness and what may be the experience of unconsciousness for people who are in fact dying. Now, the reason I've got it on slides is because there are going to be a few things that would be better or more easily understood by seeing the picture. But I've also put it on slides for the benefit of people who can't attend to today's or this morning's session, who may wish to look at it. And so the slides may be a bit descriptive, but it's done simply to help people who may not be attending today. And I've subtitled it A Time of Peace or A Time of Suffering, simply because there is a divided opinion as to whether the period of unconsciousness is a time of intense suffering for the people who are dying, or whether it's a time of profound peace. And I want to explore that just a little bit throughout the session. Now, look, we're going to have questions towards the end. So maybe even if something pops up that really you feel is urgent, it might be best if we leave it to the end, because I'd like to feel that we have 20 minutes to really engage in deep conversation, rather than me give a spot answer to a question that may need a lot more time. So what do we know about unconsciousness? First thing is, and I'm talking about palliative care rather than acute care or death by accident, that in palliative care, we could say about 90 to 95% of the people we care for will actually pass through a phase of what has been termed fairly universally as a phase of unconsciousness, but later on you'll hear that I'm going to challenge the use of that word, and I'll give you my reasons for that. But for the time being, I'll call it unconsciousness. So 90% of the people we care for will become unconscious before they die. And it's for that reason I believe we should know a little bit more about unconsciousness, because while we are in the dark about what is happening with these people and perhaps what's going on in the mind of these people, there's no way we can deliver quality care. We need to have some idea of what their experience may be to better care for them. And seeing it involves 90% of our population, that makes this form of study even more urgent. It's been shown from studies that have been done that when someone becomes unconscious, and that decision about when someone becomes unconsciousness is generally made when they can no longer respond to either the spoken voice or some form of stimulation, such as turning or some form of intervention. And that's when we say they are unconscious. So if we take that at the starting point, the duration of unconsciousness may be as short as minutes, but it could also last for days. The average or median time, however, is 24 hours. Now that's 24 hours by the clock. And if you talk to any family member or friend who's sitting in vigil, they will say it feels much longer. Now, the care of the unconscious patient has improved dramatically over time, but we have little or no knowledge of what the patient is actually experiencing. And this is a problem because we make an assessment based on what we see, not, in fact, on the experience of the patient, simply because up until recently we've had no way of measuring that. So what up until now, their experience has been mystery, as have been many of the things that can happen during the period of unconsciousness. And these include lightening up or deathbed visions. I think most people are familiar with deathbed visions, when someone who's been unresponsive or unconscious for hours and sometimes days will all of a sudden gesture with their arms out forward, or they'll sit up as if and stare straight ahead as if they're watching something. And we now know that almost certainly these people are seeing visions of predeceased relatives, often mother, father or sibling. Lightening up could refer to deathbed visions, but it simply could refer to someone who's been unresponsive and all of a sudden wakes up and says something like, "I'm thirsty." "Oh, it's good to see you again." Or, "Where have you been?" And that period of lightness may persist for minutes or hours, and then they lapse back into unconsciousness. Now, what's been interesting is an observation made by Sandy McLeod from New Zealand, who, like I, has been around for quite a long time. One of his observations is that lightening up used to be very common, but we rarely see it now. And his explanation is it's because of the medication we're using. The only point I would like to make is that my belief is they are still having some experience, but they're just so weak, or the effect of medication is such that they actually can't demonstrate it in a physical form. So I don't think medication actually stops them having dreams, visions, and perhaps being aware of what's going on. They just don't have the strength, or the effect of medication is such they just can't demonstrate that they are actually having that experience. Now, the other thing we know about unconsciousness is for the family, it's a period of intense suffering because they're overwhelmed by the fact that their relative is about to die. But often they have some concerns about aspects of care, such as medication, the fact that they're not eating or drinking, and the list goes on and on. Now, I won't say much about that. I'll say a little about medication. But if there are any questions about the nature of these concerns, we can address that in the Q&A, which I hope we'll have approximately 20 minutes for. So why is there so little known about the experience, the patient's experience? And the first and most obvious reason is they are unable to tell us what they're experiencing. Most of the knowledge, and I'll say more about this later, of what people experience when they're unconscious comes from people who have been admitted to intensive care, either because anyway, whatever the cause was, they were admitted because they were unconscious. But many of these people survived and were able to tell us the story. And I'll say something about that. But our belief is their experience possibly gives us some insight as to what palliative care patients who are dying and unresponsive are going through. So that's the first reason we know little about what their experience may be. But the other one, which I'd like to just spend a few minutes on, is the fact there's been so little research into the experience of unconsciousness in dying patients. Firstly, for ethical reasons. Up until recently, it's felt that such research would be most intrusive and insensitive. And I'll give you feedback from families as to what they felt about this type of research later on. Research into dying patients is given a low priority amongst palliative care doctors, and the greater focus has been on symptom management and delivery of care. Very valuable areas of research, but it's meant that there has, until the last 10 years, been hardly any research into the experience of dying within a palliative care unit. Secondly, or thirdly, if you want funding, and this type of research does cost money, no one wants to fund research into death. People are willing to fund research into which there could be some financial incentive for the outcome of the research. And so death doesn't rank very high in that area. So it's very hard to get funding for research into death. I've been asked to evaluate certain research projects in palliative care when they were applying for funding. And this was basically European funding. And the type of funding they're looking at to do valuable research is about $20,000. And the type of research they were doing was first class, and they had first class scholars in this who were involved in this research, but not one of the applications got funding. And my belief was simply because other areas were highly attractive from a community point of view rather than palliative care. And finally, lack of suitable instruments. And I'll say more about that later. But anyway, for the last 10 years, there's been little done. But there's now a much greater interest. And the main reason, and it's the third dot point, is because the result of animal studies, but human intensive care studies in intensive care units, has shown something that's almost unbelievable. And it has been shown that the brain, at just before the moment of death, shows states of awareness that are almost equivalent to the waking state. And this has been a dramatic finding which has got the research community wondering what is going on in the mind of people during this phase of unconsciousness, particularly when they're dying. The other reason we're now finding much more research is that ethics committee are much more open to well-conducted research into the experience of dying. We have technology that's not invasive. But even more important, when we're doing research and we approach patients, and the type of question we will put to them, the way we approach it, we will describe the research along the lines that when you become unresponsive, we would like to connect you to a machine to get some idea of what you may be experiencing. And we were blown over by the fact that virtually 90% of the patients we approached before they became unconscious wanted to be involved, because they said, even though we're dying, we would still like to think we can contribute to science. And I think we have made a great mistake thinking how intrusive and invasive it would be to ask them to participate in research. We've made the choice because we feel uncomfortable. Patients don't feel uncomfortable, providing the research is done in a way that it might in fact improve the care of unconscious patients. And the other thing we've found, when we were getting approval from patients to contribute or to participate in the studies, families were a little more hesitant, but if the patient agreed, they tended to agree. But we interviewed 3/4 of the families of people who had died in our unit, who participated in the study. We interviewed them 1 month after their relative had died. And we had a conversation with them about what that experience of being with their dying relative was like for them, and whether they felt the research we were doing and the machine that we had attached to their relative's forehead, whether that intruded into what we would consider a sacred space. And apart from words to tell us what they thought, we want to get a quantitative measure as to the effect this had on them. And so we gave them a choice on a linear scale from 1 to 10, when 1 is the worst outcome for them possible. In other words, it was intrusive, insensitive, and it interfered with them being able to sit comfortably with their dying relative. 10 was exactly the opposite. It wasn't insensitive. They felt that it was very supportive for them, and it helped them better understand what was going on, and it didn't intrude in their grieving. And so 1 was the lowest score, 10 was the highest score. 29 families ranked it, and the score we got was 9.2. In other words, they felt it was they were glad their relative had done it, and they were glad to support research that might actually help in the care of future people who die. Okay, so that's a bit of background. So the problem we face is the wider community sees unconsciousness only as time of suffering. And why should a patient suffer when there are possible ways of ending this suffering? And in Victoria, that would include voluntary assisted dying. And in states that don't have voluntary assisted dying, it's also almost an implicit request that we do something to shorten what they consider to be a period of suffering. And on the left are the type of comments they would make. It's cruel, they wouldn't let their pet dog suffer this way, it's a pointless existence, or it's not how I would want to die. And that gives you some idea of what the majority of family and friends feel when they're sitting with someone who's not able to respond. They see that purely and simply as a time of suffering. And it says to me what a big job we've got to indicate that it may not be all suffering, and in fact there may be positive outcomes in this. Now, this is a very fine line to tread, and I'm not one for gilding the lily and trying to say, no, you're wrong, it's quite the opposite. I think we have to be aware of how people feel, and that's the starting point. But the sadness for me is to think that they can't see that there may in fact be some sense of peace that can actually come from that experience. And what makes us wonder about this is not just what's coming up in the research, but when you have comments such as you see on the right, that of Steve Jobs, who said when he died, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. In other words, he was seeing something that was so uplifting for him, to use those words. Thomas Edison, when he was dying, said it's very beautiful over there. He was seeing something beyond the physical world. I'm not saying or suggesting there is an afterlife. I don't want to raise that topic here, but it's one people often like to engage in. Another one was a woman who was dying immediately after the birth of her first and only child. And she said, if you could see what I could see, you would understand. You would understand why I'm happy to die. And the other comments which we hear regularly is something like, my mother is here or my sister is here. In other words, they're having visions that are bringing them a sense of peace, but almost eliminate the fear of dying. So that's the challenge that we as carers face, trying to walk that fine line in acknowledging the suffering family members feel about it, but trying to help them to understand that if we can create a healing space around their dying, we not only does that maybe benefit the person that's dying, but ultimately it's going to benefit the people, the relatives who are there, because the way they will cope with their grief is going to be influenced dramatically by the way they see that person's death. And if they can see that person has died peacefully and in a way that they may consider was better than they had expected, their grief is going to be much less than it otherwise may be. So what do we know about the patient's experience? Now, one of the greatest studies from my point of view was one done by a nurse from an intensive care unit. She interviewed 100 patients who had been treated in the intensive care unit that she worked in, but they had survived. And she went and visited 100 of them and said, tell me what you remember of that period of time when you're unconscious. To her surprise, only a quarter or 27% said they had no memory of it whatsoever. But the remaining 73% said during that time, for great periods, they were very aware of what was happening around them, what was being done to them, and the emotions that were going on inside of them. And the way we describe that is they had great awareness of their outer world, but also an equal awareness of how they felt about what was going on. So I think you can get some understanding. If we can create a good outer environment, that's going to help them with regards how they're perceiving things and how they indeed would feel during that period of unconsciousness. And the same applies to people who die. But many of them had out-of-body experiences. They dissociated from their body. Many of them described deathbed visions, and many of them had dreams which they found to be very comforting to them. Even equally valuable was a study done by two anaesthetists in Victoria, and they interviewed in depth 5 people who had been unconscious in their palliative care unit and survived, and they found 3 common themes with all 5 patients. The first one was the sense of helplessness. They just couldn't move. The second one was that all of them described dreams, visions, and out-of-body experiences. In other words, they left their body. And the other one, which is very important from the point of view of us as carers, but family members also, the safety and security they got from being told what was being done to them, the security they felt when a human presence was there and connected with them, particularly if that person was someone they knew and had a very strong emotional connection to them. The positive experience of having someone communicate to them, and how good it was to be free of pain. And you can see the relevance of all of this with people we care for in palliative care services who are dying. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated, and I'm going to now clarify what I consider to be one of the problems we have about unconsciousness. Because when we use the word unconscious, we think it's the opposite of consciousness, meaning there is no consciousness or no awareness. And that is anything but the truth. It is a misleading term because we have made a judgment. Just because the person is not moving, not speaking, and not responding in any way, we believe they are just not aware. And that is absolutely wrong. And what we should be using, and I hope before I die I see this become fairly common, is that rather than unconscious, we say they are unresponsive, because that is fact. When they're not moving, it's a fair comment to say they are unresponsive. But you cannot draw a long bow on that and say they are therefore unaware. There is no such thing as unconsciousness or no consciousness. All there is, or all there are different forms of consciousness. And down below you can see I've listed the forms of consciousness, and this is only a selection. So at the moment, all of us are awake and aware. That's waking consciousness. With a boring talk, or if you're just sitting down in the afternoon with a cup of tea and just daydreaming, that is a totally different form of consciousness. And then there's the consciousness just as you're falling off to sleep, which we call hypnagogic state. Then there is sleeping consciousness, dreaming consciousness, the consciousness when you're waking up, the consciousness associated with anesthesia and sedation, the consciousness associated with dying, and the consciousness that is present immediately before death. And in each one of those forms of consciousness, there is some form of awareness. And I won't have time to go into that in great depth, but the one thing you might say, and many people say, look, I've had an anaesthetic and I have no awareness whatsoever of what happened at that time. I will say to you, there was awareness there, but just like you cannot remember your dreams from last night, you probably have stored the information you assimilated during anaesthetic in that same part of the brain and you can't access it. And if any people are interested in this, there is a wonderful book written by a journalist called Anesthesia, and she talks about the type of things people can remember when in fact they say they have no memory, but if they're then put into a form of a hypnotic state, they will describe things that would blow your mind about what they remember during their anaesthesia. Now, the other thing to remember, if you look at that consciousness linear graph, awake, daydreaming, and hypnagogic states, what we tend to be aware of in those states are things that are happening around us in the outer world. Like you're taking notice of me talking, you're watching the screen, you're perhaps aware, can hear things happening in the outside world. So all your senses are tuned into the outside world. But when you move into sleeping, dreaming, sedation, dying, it's not so much awareness of what's happening around you. There may be some awareness of what's happening to your body, like pain, but most of your awareness is in your or into your inner world, the visions and dreams that come. So what we say, when people move into an unconscious or unresponsive state, they are not aware so much of what's happening to them or around them, but they're now turning into and focusing very much on their inner world, which is extremely rich and very vivid, so vivid to them, it is the truth. And when we have palliative care patients who are still conscious and have dreams and visions of predeceased relatives, they are absolutely convinced that was a real experience and not a dream. And exactly the same thing is happening with people who are unresponsive. The only thing is they can't tell you about it. Now, this is reassuring because if you're thinking, oh, how terrible it must be for unconscious or unresponsive patients who are dying to be aware of what's going on with them. The point I'm making, it's not so much what's going on with them, it's an awareness of what's going on inside of them. And that is very comforting, because I am sort of jumping off the deep end here. My belief is that most of the visions, dreams and experiences of their inner world are very positive, and I believe that's an evolutionary fact to help us during what could otherwise be a frightening time. And I hope I get time to just say a bit more about that later. So rather than unconsciousness, we should be talking about responsiveness, and that's the patient's physical response to events. And they may respond because of things that are happening on the outside, but they may also respond because they're having a dream or vision. If you are as fortunate as I to have had people who have been unresponsive and all of a sudden sit up in bed, arms out, don't say a word, but they're clearly seeing someone. That vision has been so real and so tempting, they have been able to gather strength and have a response to it. But often they may not, as I said earlier on in the piece. The responsiveness, however, might be groaning, movement, speaking, or sitting up. The other thing to remember, and I've said this earlier, medication and weakness because of their illness may impair the degree of responsiveness. Then hand in hand with responsiveness is awareness. But what we should remember, the absence of response, meaning the fact they're not moving, doesn't mean to say they are unaware. And my belief is that people who are unresponsive and dying, they are aware of some things that are happening to them on the outside, particularly comfort, pain and comfort measures. But what they are most aware of is what's going on inside of them, dreams and visions. And that's what I call the lived experience. And we don't get much of an idea of what their lived experience is because they can't tell us. And if they're not able to respond, there's no way we can even hazard a guess of what may be going on. But with some of the new monitoring equipment, we are starting to get some insight into what may be going on. And that's what I want to move on to now. And I don't want to say too much about this equipment because we haven't got much time left. But now, and the type of research we did, we got permission and ethics approval for when people became people who were dying and they became unresponsive. We would connect them to this machine, which is called a bispectral index monitor, or for short, BIS monitor. And they would have a lead on their forehead, which would go to that machine that you could see on the left. And that machine actually gave us a measure of their awareness. And in the middle picture, you can see that squiggly graph, and it's going at a level of 60. If you can see that vertical column from 0 to 100. Now, if the level was 100, that would say they're wide awake. And if it was 0, that means they're dead, no awareness. The only time people don't have awareness is with death. We've found with anaesthesia and with people who are dying who are unresponsive, it's around 60, which, as I said, is equivalent to having an anaesthetic. So I'm only introducing that because I'm just going to show you some of the things that we saw in research. And this was research done 20 years ago when I was in Canberra. And it wasn't so much research. I knew this machine was being used in anaesthetics to guide them in their use of anaesthetic agents and pain relief. And my thinking was, oh, there could be some place for this in palliative care. So this is what we learnt. And we learnt it and were blown away by it. And I must admit, I found it somewhat scary to think up until that time I'd been treating people and making judgments about their comfort simply because I would base that on whether they were responding, groaning, grimacing, restlessness and whatever. And if they weren't moving, my impression was that they were comfortable. Now, graph 1, you can see on the left, it starts at about 60. And all of a sudden, it went up to 100, which is the type of result you would have if you were connected to the machine while you're wide awake. Now, it went up to 100. This woman, when that recording was 100, if you looked at her, there was no movement whatsoever, no grimacing, no groaning, nothing at all to suggest that she was having an experience, and certainly nothing to suggest she was having an experience of pain. The thing that concerned me, this happened every time we were dressing a gangrenous ulcer on her leg. And it happened 3 times. While we weren't dressing, her score was 60, which suggested she was comfortable. When we did the dressing, it went up to 100. She didn't grimace or groan. The usual things were used to help us decide. And then when we finished the dressing, she was back into that comfort state. So after 3 times, I said, let's give her an extra dose of morphine, what we call a breakthrough dose, before we do the next dressing. And from henceforth, graph 2 is what happened. She didn't wake up, she felt no pain, and she remained peaceful throughout that dressing. So that was quite a surprise. Graph 3 was the first patient we ever connected to the machine, the first patient we ever did or conducted our research. This was a young boy dying of HIV. And when we connected him to the machine, his score was just a bit below 60. And as fate would have it, just as we got it all set up and running, the bedside phone rang. And that caused the first increase in the score. And there's no doubt in my mind that phone ringing disturbed the sense of peace, that peaceful state he was in. When his mother, who was waiting outside the room, heard about this, she said if he heard the phone, would he hear my voice? So I was a bit concerned about what I thought was likely to happen, that she would whisper or speak to him and nothing would happen. But she went up to him, whispered to him, and that second bump is his response to her words. So he did hear. And we now know that people, and this is different research, we now know that people who are dying maintain the hearing reflex and connections almost up to the last hour of life. I won't go into the last one because I'm going to say a bit more about that towards the end, and we're running short of time. Now, this is an important graph, and it's been proven over and over again now. And this is just to show the safety of using appropriate doses of medication to relieve pain. A woman, again, you can see top left-hand graph, her score is running around 60, and all of a sudden on that first arrow, you can see it jumps up and it stays up and stays up from about 55 up to about 70, and in fact gets up to 80. Second arrow, top right, we give her a breakthrough dose of morphine. And third arrow, you can see after about half an hour, she's now back to that peaceful level, which is about 55 to 60. And the only reason I'm showing you this is because all the pain relief did was relieve pain. It didn't increase the sedation, but in relieving pain, this woman was able to go back into that peaceful, comfortable state of sleep, or whatever you want to call it, that had previously been interrupted by pain. And this was only to reassure you and other people that appropriate doses of morphine will relieve pain and create a more comfortable state, but won't do that by just increasing sedation. And this becomes important because we're talking about how to create comfort. Pain relief is most important. This is now, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because this is an area that I could speak for hours. These are what we've found when people die. Remember I said research with animals and patients in ICU have shown that a high proportion of people just before they die will show a sudden increase in their level of awareness. And A, B, and C show that fairly definitely. And the big question is, what is this all about? And the argument is it just the effects of a dying brain? But there is now very strong evidence and more evidence to suggest it may be more than that. In fact, I'm hosting a Zoom conference this Friday when someone's going to be saying that it looks very much like it could be because of a dream or vision that they're having just before death. So awareness right up to the moment of death is the inner awareness is always orientated to keeping people emotionally comfortable during that dying phase. You may have questions, and if so, we can deal with that during question time. But what I want to do now is, what can we do to ensure as much as we can that this time of unresponsiveness is one of peace? And I'm talking now for the person that's dying. I will say a bit more about how we can make it a peaceful time, or a more peaceful time for family. I always believe that this is only possible if you know the patient and his or her wishes for care. We need to know who we're caring for and the way they wish to be cared for. And so the longer we have with someone before they die, the more comfortable they will be to submit to their dying if they know they're in the hands of someone they trust, respect, and someone who will respect their wishes around the time of dying. I make a really big point of this because what concerns me is how people, when they're dying, are often transferred from a place where they know and are comfortable with to somewhere where it may not be as familiar or as comfortable, or where they have that same degree of trust. So I think it's important to recognise, particularly in this era when there's so many people involved in care, that there is one or several people who are regularly involved in the care of these people, and that includes family, of course, but also professionals and doulas and other people involved in care. There needs to be some constant person there who they know, trust, and can unburden all their concerns with. The second most important point is to ensure pain and comfort. Because remember, we're talking about people whose awareness is focused on their inside world. And my belief is that is nearly always going to be a peaceful experience for them. And the one thing that will, or the one important and common thing that will draw them out of that peaceful state is pain and discomfort. And so our use of pain relief and comfort measures when someone is unresponsive is not because we're trying to hasten death, or not because we have a vested interest in medicating people who are dying. It's because we know that if we can relieve their pain, those people can savour that comfortable, safe inner space that's there to comfort them at that time. And the thing that will draw them out of it more than anything else is pain. And so we need to know that they are getting the best care, but we also need to be able to rely on much more than just our naked eye. And that's why down the end, I believe, and I may be jumping ahead, but I reckon in 10 years' time, most people who are dying will at some stage of their unresponsive time be connected to a BIS type monitor to ensure that the treatment they're getting is in fact delivering the goods. And we're not just relying on gut feeling, which I have a great respect for, and what we're seeing. We should utilise every bit of information we can get, because this is such an important time for the person that's dying, but it's also a very significant time for the people who are there grieving them, relatives and loved ones. So I make a big point of how important it is to make sure people are comfortable. Always assume the unresponsive person has some level of outer awareness, and so you know that our job is to inform family and friends, not to speak to, they must speak to them and not about them. To talk across them is just bad form, but it can also be very harmful to them. Always inform unresponsive patients if we are going to do a procedure or do something such as mouth care, turn them or give them an injection, because that can not only disturb them and cause them discomfort, but the surprise of what's happening to them when they haven't been forewarned can not only take them out of that safe inner world, but to one where they're feeling helpless and uncertain about what's going on. I won't say much because the rest is fairly standard: regular verbal and tactile connections, avoid unnecessary intervention and conversation. And I say that because there are some families who will talk their dying patient to death because they just don't stop. Silence, these people are in a safe space, and so to respect that and give them time to immerse themselves in it. So we certainly need to connect with them and to validate the person that's dying, but also to remember that their inner experience is doing the same thing, and perhaps often a lot better than what we can do. The other thing I'll make a strong point of is I was laying awake at 4 o'clock this morning feeling nervous about my talk, and as luck would have it, there was a talk on ABC radio on tactile sensation. And the point they made is the first sense that's stimulated in us as human beings is touch. And we get that in utero. And so it comes as no surprise that tactile connection is a very important one for the majority of people. Not everyone, but the majority of people. And if you know your patient, you're going to know if tactile sensation is very important to them. And if it is, how to holding hands, massaging, and brushing hair may in fact be a very valuable way of communicating with them. I'm interested in it because I'm a twin, and so I believe I got a double dose of tactile sensation, and perhaps that's why it's not just because I'm Italian, but because I'm a twin that I'm touchy-feely. So I think that it might sound trite, but all these little things about knowing about people can help you. Create a healing space. And finally, remembering I said suffering is particularly the perception of family. So anything we can do to empower, educate and support family during this time is not only going to benefit them in the short term, but also in their grieving, but it'll also benefit the person that's dying, because I believe that there is this intuitive sense of people who are dying, that if there is someone in the room that's tearful, howling, or really fearful, there can be that connection. And I won't say more about that here, but you might ask a question about it later. Now, I'm not going to say anything about the last slide, but this, and I only want to introduce it, this was an article written in the Sunday Mail 14 years ago, and it was an interview of a young man who had been unconscious in hospital for about 1 to 2 weeks, and he just talks about his experience. And if you read this later, it will guide you in the type of things that are absolutely necessary when caring for someone who is unresponsive. Because he tells us here, and I've highlighted in red, the type of things that caused him confusion or which increased his helplessness, but also told us the things that made that period of time bearable for him and brought him a sense of comfort and support and belief that everything would be okay. Okay, that's all I've got to say, so thank you for your time. I'm just going to stop sharing, and we've got, I apologise, I've robbed you of 10 minutes of questions, but I can stay as long as you can stay. Okay.
Thank you.